We can start now. Welcome to our Tuesday ESC for seminar series. And for this week, we have our discussion of a region, the Eastern Mediterranean, which is not exactly the conventional region as we know, the Balkans or the Baltics or the Nordics or the Caucasus, etc. But it's much more about countries connected by a sea. And a very important as well, increasingly important region for the European Union, but also the rest of the world. Now, this is also part of a project that we would like to initiate at CSOX on the Eastern Mediterranean region. And it's more about focusing on particular thematics that connect or divide the actors in the region, not just the local, but also the external bigger powers, etc. We want to address through this project, which I repeat is at the process of conception and initial realization, to look at thematics that have to do with migration, energy, climate change, interaction with the Euro-Atlantic organizations. And that's why we've got this very rich panel today of those wonderful experts and very good colleagues. We would like to start this conversation of what this region is all about, what defines the region, and what are the main issues that connect the region, and also how the region is affected by global developments, geopolitical and geoeconomics. So let me just then present the speakers very quickly. We start with Alex Clarkson, who is from the King's College in London. He has done his PhD here at Baylor College, and he is somebody that has written a lot about diaspora, but also about periphery and about regionalism and regionalization. Then we will continue with Manal, who is from the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies here in Oxford, but also associated with St. Antony's College. Manal is an economist, and she's working on the political economic issues that relate to our region. Like energy is one of her kind of strongest points. And then we continue with Constantinos, Filis, who came from Athens. He is one of the foremost experts in Greece on those issues that have to do with the Eastern Mediterranean. But at the same time, he's been an Antonian because he's been associated with CSOX and St. Antony's in the past. And he's an associate professor at the American College of Greece. And last but not least, Galip Dalai, who is doing his doctorate at the moment at St. Antony's College, but who is also connected with the Chatham House, and he also connects with many other think tanks, because Galip has written a lot about the region and a lot about Turkey's position in the region as well. So with that, let's start with Alex, and let's see what you have to tell us.
Sorry, if I keep looking upwards, it's because my presentation is there. So it thinks it's there, so we'll just sort of get through it. So yeah, I'm Manal Clarkson, I'm a lecturer in German and European Studies at King's College London. I'm at the European International Studies Department, and sort of my research focus is sort of dual. My original doctoral research and my books are on the history of diasporas and how diasporas connects the politics of their country of origin with the politics of their country of settlements. And so, of course, we're focusing on 4 states of the EU, that's Germany, France, and elsewhere. These diasporas include Turkey, Greece, Iran, Libya, and so on. So that's been sort of a lot of what I've been doing for a long time. More recently, I've also, the other half of what I do is very much more from my department in a sort of very typical King's College way. I arrived and they said, here's these modules that you need to teach. And I said, I've never done research on them before, and they said, good luck. And so out of that actually came a really interest in borders and EU border system. And the extent to which, in my view, there's a bit of a division in my department about this. One of the ways in which you can see that the EU is going through a kind of classic, in theoretical terms, state formation process is the way it interacts with states in and around its borders, the way it increasingly delineates its territory as a kind of unified, integrated space and distinguishes that space in increasing levels of hierarchy between its inner and the outer its various outer rings. So that's become a sort of the other half of what it is. So it links that there are spaces like the Eastern Mediterranean. So what I do in this other half of my work is, I look at how the EU interacts with different geopolitical spaces around it. I'm half Ukrainian, so obviously Ukraine, Black Sea is a very strong preoccupation. Libya, Syria, of course, and the kind of underlying dynamics. So I think one of the most interesting spaces in all this is Italy, but maybe that's for a different panel, as well as the Maghreb and the Sahel, and also the way in which the EU as a kind of a regionalization integration project interacts in the Sahel with ECOWAS, which is a kind of viable regional integration project. But today I'm going to focus on the Eastern Mediterranean, and sort of also play with ideas of periphery and center as periphery. So
Once more.
Breach.
I'll help you out.
This is great. This is great on Zoom.
That's strange. Oops, there we go.
Thank you. So I view EU accession, among other things, as a process of deperipheralization. I know that doesn't exactly sound very catchy, but I think it captures a lot of the attraction of joining the EU for member states. I think there has been a lot of work over the last 20 and 30 years looking at the concept of center and periphery more critically, saying how far do we have to critique the concept, how far this notion of center and periphery maybe sort of reflects outdated imperial or colonial patterns of thought. I think for all that is very useful, and those are very useful perspectives, and they're very important perspectives. But in the end, ultimately, power centers around particular geopolitical and geoeconomic concentrations. Of course, you have traces of empire within them, but that doesn't stop change. We can see the rise of new imperial or global powers with India and elsewhere. So this is, in that sense, there are peripheries and there are centers. There are geopolitical peripheries and there are centers. And if we look into kind of wider European context, if you look at states like Greece and Cyprus, until their accession to the EU, there are conflicts and internal dynamics, the tensions between Greece and Turkey, for example, over the Aegean. They're often framed historically, if you look at the files and diplomatic files in various European archives, or at the way they're reported in the media in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're reported and framed in the same orientalizing fashion that we now still use for places like Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on. So until quite recently, Cyprus and Greece were in that periphery. And it also, just looking at it in a religious context, if you're Greek Orthodox, the idea that being Greek Orthodox or Orthodox Christian puts you at the center of the kind of European geopolitical entity, that's relatively new, right? I remember very well, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, how Ukrainians were, or 20 years ago, how Ukrainians were discussed in German media or French media, and the extent to which they were a periphery out there. Maybe it actually belonged to the Russians after all. The extent to which that was a conventional wisdom of the 1990s is perhaps put aside. And you can see the same in terms of discourses towards Greece under the dictatorship in 67 to 74. This is over there to our over here in West Germany and France. So the EU's process of enlargement state formation are reordering each neighboring region along, including those along the Eastern Mediterranean. And they're doing that in three ways through this process of deperipheralization. By joining the accession process, you go from periphery to the center almost overnight, right? You go from somebody who has things done to it to somebody who does things to others. I think if there's one way of defining what is a center, it's the ability to do something to other people that they can't do to you. And in that process, you can again have access to a whole range of global power opportunities that you would never have as one of these states on the fringes in a pre-say 1992 sense of what was the European Economic and European Community. To use a kind of a Roman metaphor, if you join the EU, you can go from being auxiliary to being from one of the peoples through which you have can make an emperor, right? I'm not comparing Elizabeth von der Leyen to a Roman emperor, but it is the kind of core dynamic of this concept. And it's access to the European Council, Commission, Parliament, and Central Bank. It's that kind of not triad, it's that core institutions that place you at the heart of a kind of a whole set of European decision-making process. And so the expanding reach of the EU single market Schengen border system, that pressures neighboring states that want access to the European markets to reordering their own legal system. So the other metaphor I use, I hope some of you have watched Star Trek. is the board, and the EU in many ways is kind of a nice board. It doesn't really want to assimilate you, but the moment it approaches you, you have to adapt and adjust every one of your legal, economic, political, even military systems in response. That doesn't mean you like it. That doesn't mean necessarily you want to be integrated, but you have to respond to it. Again, that's a very imperial dynamic in this process. So next slide. So in this context, this is where I find these kind of interactions fascinating. It's also the extent to which once the EU comes into contact with one region, say the Sahel, the dynamics of that region become increasingly intertwined with dynamics elsewhere. So I'm not claiming that Wagner or Russian mercenaries or the links with the Soviet Union are not necessarily a new phenomenon in Sahel or Maghreb and West Africa. There are clearly Cold War continuities in this context. But I think rival the EU, the role of the EU in that context, that increases the attraction for Russia, for example, to act as a disruptor in that kind of region. So you have this pressure to adjust to institutions. You have neighboring states that can slide from one framework to another. I don't claim this is a linear process, right? This is something that, depending on domestic politics, depending on the politics of the EU. Remember where Turkey, how Turkey was discussed in 2004. Right, how it's discussed now. You can slide in and out of it, but there are various rings or various processes that you go through that you can through this process. And through the accession of Greece and Cyprus to the EU, the Eastern Mediterranean became part of this widening EU system. But that's also a two-way process. The EU absorbs you, but it also absorbs your strategic culture with it. Every time EU accession happens, it doesn't just change the states that are going through accession, it changes the strategic culture of the European Union. Now we can sort of discuss how much there's a kind of top-down process. I think one of the great flaws and problems of the EU is a lack of kind of national security council or central entity that gives strategic direction. There's very good strategic direction from the EU, but there's a lot of strategic culture. I think these are two kind of distinct concepts that we need to keep in mind. So in this process of absorbing Greece and Cyprus, there are aspects of their strategic culture, particularly in terms of maritime claims in the Mediterranean, in terms of exclusive economic zones. In terms of, I know Cyprus is in a more difficult position in relation to the Commission because the Commission wants to do things with CRNC that Cyprus doesn't necessarily want to do, and I think that there is clearly a tension in that case. But clearly Cyprus, once it has a seat in the European Council, is the part of the empire, so to speak, and then gains leverage over others in ways that would be unimaginable in this concept. If you could move on to that's the wrong way. So, no, sorry, that is the right thing. Sorry, yeah. So in that context, what are these different rings? What are these different hierarchies I'm talking about? So the EU has sort of 5 distinct neighborhood structures. There's associated membership against the auxiliaries. This is the closest you can get to being part of the EU without actually being part of the EU. I mean, after years of Brexit and all that stuff, European Economic EEA, the EFTA frameworks, these kind of Switzerland with this particular frameworks, where Ukraine is pretty much heading, I think, even if it doesn't become a full EU member. So you have full, and that's defined through full access to the single market, but reciprocal acceptance of the 4 freedoms. That actually also gives these states a lot of influence and leverage. They are listened to in Brussels, but they're not at the top seat. The next step is stabilization association states. These are kind of candidate states that they're actually going to have less leverage. They're in a more subordinate position to the system because they want to get into it. Ironically, if you want to get into the system, you lose a lot of leverage. You have deep and comprehensive partnerships that states put in a kind of holding pattern with which the EU has deep relations, but doesn't necessarily want to have full accession. You have a lot of the non-European or a lot of the Arab states in the Eastern Mediterranean are, I would argue, trapped in, which is kind of NDICI relationship. It's sort of the southern neighborhood policy isn't so much a policy as a holding pattern to these people away and give them something to keep them quiet so that migrants don't come here. And finally, we have these integrated adversaries, states like Russia and Belarus or Turkey, maybe arguably now, that are both highly hostile to European integration, but also economically, politically, socially, culturally intertwined. Go to the next slide, please. Right? So several variables can affect the stability of the neighboring state's position in the EU system. So migration, border management, diaspora politics, government's rule, obviously rule of law disputes, the territorial disputes, this is where we come to the Eastern Mediterranean. Divergent or convergent security priorities, investment trade, competition from the EU's geostrategic rivals. So how the EU has managed tensions over such variables with one neighboring state sets precedent for other neighboring states. This is where I think if you want to have this perspective of what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, you also have to have an eye on the Black Sea. You have to have an eye on the Maghreb and Sahel. You have to have an eye on what's even happening with Finland now in terms of then the Russia trying to push migrants across. Each of these different parts of the puzzle are interconnected. And that's also where the EU is very slow engaging with Cyprus, for example, because it is concerned that there might be various precedents set. in terms of how it handles the oil and gas disputes. You can't just understand what the EU is doing with Cyprus and deal with Cyprus. You have to understand how that interconnects in the succession of other strategic challenges. Next slide, please. Right, and a number of these strategic challenges are outlined here. I haven't got the time to go into detail, but there's, Kaliningrad, that's an ongoing source, ongoing place of high geopolitical risk. But also the extent to which these different states, Transnistria, Kaliningrad, Gibraltar, or Ceuta, Melilla, in a different way, Northern Ireland, it also gives local actors, as long as there's a degree of strategic ambiguity between the EU and the other state, also a degree of leverage, right? So the issue of central periphery, of course, isn't always straightforward. What the Transnistrian leadership wants isn't necessarily what Russia wants, right? The Transnistrian leadership is perfectly happy with relations to the EU. So I don't want to over-egg this kind of old school central periphery model. Of course, all of these different contested spaces, all of the political actors within them can develop leverage as long as there is still strategic ambiguity in relations between the EU and whoever's neighboring. But whatever happens with Cyprus, for example, is thought of, and TRNC will always, from Brussels' perspective, be thought of in the context of all these other issues and conflicts to deal with. Next slide, please.
2 minutes.
Right, thank you. So the Eastern Mediterranean is both a European center and a periphery, right? Greece and Cyprus means that the EU is part of this space. One of the biggest mistakes EU policymakers make is saying, we are external, this is part of our foreign policy, you're a neutral arbiter. The EU can never be a neutral arbiter as long as its strategic culture is affected by Greece and Cyprus. So as a smaller EU, the Greek state is in a position again to define EU policy in the process, both EU and Cyprus can ensure that Brussels will always side in a certain direction. In that sense, Turkey does have one. Right? You can't, when Brussels comes and it's weird here, no, Turkey is not mediating, arbitrating. It's on a side, and I think a bit more clarity about that also in terms of the discussion with the Commission will be helpful. And actors in the region outside the integration, including Israel, Lebanon, and Palestinian Authority, they face a more peripheral status. Right? My argument, actually, just ending at this point, is the extent to which the EU can really continue in a policy where it pretends that the Eastern Mediterranean has not been an integrated political, economic, and cultural space for like 3,000-4,000 years. Right? And the problem with this kind of model is that you're creating kind of a border and a clear line between the inside and the outside that on one hand works in terms of what the EU being the center and these states being peripheral, but doesn't necessarily mesh particularly well with how all of these societies are still interlocked with one another. Right? So, then there comes to the argument, does the EU need to make an integration offer? Does the EU need to, in a way, expand its system further, but then in the end into an imperial discussion about when does the EU stop expanding its system to solve these problems? But that's ultimately one of the dilemmas, not just in the Eastern Mediterranean, but all of these points along the map. Where the EU gets to a point where one actor is within the system, one actor is on the outside, how does the EU handle this tension? Does it expand, or can it live with these kind of endemic instabilities and substance?
Thank you very much, Alex. And now we continue with Manal.
Thank you very much. I kind of want to build a bit on that, but maybe thinking of really kind of the region and maybe if it does represent kind of one entity, but really focusing more on just the energy perspective. And obviously, pre the time when we had nation states and border lines, I'm just looking at the time. It was obviously the region was really quite cohesive, and when people ask me where I come from, that's where I come from. You look at me physically or my name, whatever, I am from the Levant and from the Eastern Mediterranean, and my family does represent different parts of it. But obviously, when we come in today's world, it's a little bit more complicated than that, precisely because of the nation states. And if we can please go to the next slide. And in my work, I look at basically the intersection of, or the nexus of economics, energy, and also climate, and what that means for resource-dependent economies with a large focus on in the Middle East, which obviously kind of intersects the area here. But from the energy world, really, the Eastern Mediterranean kind of became of importance, so to speak, really with gratuitous discovery of gas in the Levant basin. No, we can stay at the previous one. And then I hope this is not set to automatic change. However, I want to talk about really kind of this gas element and basically why it made an importance from both a local perspective and then what it meant from more of a regional perspective, and kind of focus on what the gas, how gas really created a new element of geoeconomics, And then I kind of want to take it finally on my third point and look at what does this mean really in the larger context of today's energy transition. So I want to start looking really just talking about the importance of this from country perspective. Of course, a lot of this gas and the hydrocarbon resources are under the seabed of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this also explains a lot of the tensions and potential cooperation between the states over this. If you see some of the lines drawn between the countries on the map, these are what is considered the exclusive economic zone for these different countries. So Israel, for example, or Cyprus or Lebanon would have that part that it would belong to it, that it has the right to access to the gas and the hydrocarbons under that seabed. And obviously this is governed by the law of the seas from the UN. And this is also one of the problems because of how the Eastern Mediterranean is shaped. There are a lot of disagreements of how do you measure 200 miles out of the point, and how then do you measure which part kind of represents an economic exclusive zone. But what was really interesting, this is kind of like the very first initial gas discovery was actually in Gaza in kind of early the turn of the century. And then we started seeing really large discoveries in Israel in 2009 and 2010, and then subsequently in Cyprus as well in 2011, 2012, Egypt after that in 2015. And from each of these countries, particularly Egypt and Israel, this is an opportunity to really have dependence on energy sources. So you're not importing as much. And this is obviously a big deal for both of these countries that have needed to depend on other sources for hydrocarbons. So self-sufficiency was a big deal. But also, particularly from the, and obviously that large export potential, particularly for Egypt, this was really important because also Egypt had just had a lot of political turmoil. In 2013, there's failed Arab Springs across the region. And then also in 2013, there was a change of also leadership. And then there was really a dire economic situation, both bad or maybe almost depleted foreign reserves, also very high employment, political instability. The discovery of oil really represented to the government really also a source to potential income, and also in the future potentially having really a source of export. So it wasn't just self-sufficiency, but also export that was really important. And it wasn't just really the region in just in Egypt and Cyprus, even and Israel, even countries further in the Levant, Jordan, for example, which does not have a shore in the Mediterranean, also is looking to have access to the natural resources through mostly onshore rather than offshore. But what was really interesting for all of these, the political and political economic conditions in the countries have also driven a lot of the focus of governments, and in Egypt particularly through obviously the military, in these oil and gas natural reserves. And to give you an idea of what we're talking about, where the reserves in the region are estimated to be about 7 to 8% of global gas reserves. So this is not really small. This is quite substantial. And if we can please go back to the next slide. Here, I just want to kind of give you an idea of how much, obviously Egypt is the largest in terms of production. And so far from 2012, when really production kind of ramped up to about 2021, we can see that the majority of production in the region has been mostly from Egypt, with smaller values from Greece, Israel, and then obviously Turkey. And then the rest, Cyprus and Jordan, they don't really have that amount of production for annual liquid fuel. But you can see that Egypt has the lion's share, which is also partially because of its large access to onshore, but also offshore reserves and gas fields. And if we can go to the next slide, please, we can also see that there's also a similar trend when it comes to gas. So this represents, this is dry natural gas rather than liquefied natural gas. So this also then is really bringing, not only allowing these countries to play a role in the energy sector and kind of bolster its role in the region, but also particularly for Egypt, with Egypt having liquefied natural gas LNG plants and ability to export, it also had given Egypt really kind of a more of an important role as a link as well between the Middle East, which is more the traditional Middle East, but also then to Europe. And there's been still exploration that's going on. Egypt and Cyprus and Israel, even Jordan, they all have licensed out exploration to really enable and attract a lot of the foreign governments to come and invest really with really high hopes and trying obviously to have economic development and have really more of a pull in the region's energy player field, so to speak. And from here, I want to move to my second point. If you can go back to the first map, actually. Now I want to kind of talk about, now that I've a little bit given you the context of the interest from a local perspective, what this really then means from a bit more of the regional perspective, and how this kind of provided really an element of a new element of geoeconomics. When we often think of Eastern Med, a lot of people think of the pipeline or the whether that's happening or not happening, and there's a lot of skepticism about that. But obviously the interest in before the pipeline, because all of these countries are sharing the same seabed, a lot of the conflict has really arisen from basically conflict of who should get what. And this is particularly, we see Greece and Cyprus and Israel have had agreements, multilateral agreements to develop the potential of the pipeline starting from 2018, 2019. But then also Turkey was really very interested in this. And obviously Turkey also having a border of the North Mediterranean, and with claims obviously and conflicts with Greece over Cyprus, Turkey wanted to have more of the resources that are, according to Cyprus, are part of its exclusive economic zone, or its EEZ. And then when even in 2018, I believe, military from Turkey has intervened to prevent Eni, the Italian company, from exploring in the Cyprus parts of the EEZ. And obviously the EU became really interested, the US became really interested, they all intervened and they to prevent Turkey from taking hold, and in kind of retaliation and kind of asserting its role, then Turkey had an alliance with Libya, if you can think kind of from Turkey all the way to Libya, to kind of agree on maritime agreements and who owns what again. And then again, in kind of retaliation, Egypt and Cyprus ended up with another EEZ agreement, for which you see the line on the map in the middle, and also to try to basically every country claiming which part of the sea belongs to it. And of course, that also means which part of the natural resources belong to it. So you can see here then, really, we have a big source of potential tension, but at the same time, a big source of collaboration. So Israel, there's the Eastern Mediterranean Agreement, which was signed by Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, but also Jordan and Lebanon and the Palestinian authorities, as well as France were part of this. This is also another kind of opportunity for collaboration. There's a collaboration as well in trying to send or to export gas, particularly to Europe. So this is also particularly of interest to the European, particularly after the Russia-Ukraine war and the losses of the natural gas coming particularly from Russia. But also, if we look at, for example, Israel and Lebanon, these are two countries that are literally at war and do not have diplomatic relations, yet managed somehow last year to agree on agreements of where the maritime borders would be, and also Israel is exporting some of its routing some of its gas via Lebanon. So while you do have a political problem, from a geoeconomic perspective, this is really representing a real opportunity for collaboration. And of course, we can think of does this collaboration then mean also more peace in the region rather than conflict, which of course it kind of hasn't. What's been interesting, I think, from the Eastern Med is that from the pipeline, that even though there was like a big rush or a big hype, so to speak, about it, the interest in it had kind of really died down. So it was a very expensive project. It was about 1,250 kilometers of pipeline from the Eastern Med all the way to Europe via Italy and Greece. but also was expected to cost about $8 billion or so. A lot of skeptics about how could this actually happen in a region with a lot of conflict. And then the US in 2022 kind of pulled its interest out of this project on the basis of environmental interests. And yet, I think at that time is also when really kind of the interest in the pipeline has kind of diminished. But at the same time, I think now when we look at, and this is where I want to go into my third point of where are we today in terms of the future of our energy, maybe the region could actually have a role that might be even more important beyond this pipeline. And in addition to the pipeline, there's also the electricity cable also running from under the sea as well from Israel and Cyprus and Greece, and also exporting electricity to Europe, or from Egypt via Cyprus, as well as exporting electricity as well to Europe. So the region represents really also from a European perspective a real potential source of having access to energy that at the moment it's obviously needing. And now I move to my third point about perfect timing, about how this kind of, what does this mean really going forward? Because as I said, the countries were interested in this. From a regional perspective, it was kind of a big hype, and then it kind of died down from the pipeline. But then now if we're looking at kind of the larger context, Europe, as I mentioned, is already interested in having more access for or alternatives to Russian gas. But also in the larger region, if we look further down, which you can't see in the map, if we look further down at the Arabian Peninsula, you have Saudi Arabia, and you have Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. These countries are also kind of fighting for their role in the global energy scene by trying to also diversify their fossil fuel-based energy into more cleaner energy bases. And one of the plans that they've had is having green hydrogen, which is basically creating hydrogen based on renewable energy from oil and gas. The big part of that is supposed to be going partially to Asia, but also to Europe. And there have been talks also about using the pipeline infrastructure to the gas pipeline to also then use it from Neom, which is in Saudi Arabia, kind of at where the Gulf of Aqaba would be at the Red Sea, to use that to export green hydrogen into Europe. And there's been also other talks about maybe having something going all the way from Qatar via Saudi and then going all the way to Europe. And then you can think only of the myriad of issues that this arises. You know, Saudi Arabia, for example, was technically not at normalization with Israel. Is this pipeline going to go through Israel or not? And how do you actually then kind of control and who gets paid what? So there's a lot of economic and political implications. There's also technical implications because of the seismic ground of under the Mediterranean. So there are indeed challenges. Nevertheless, there is potential that this region, from a concept at least, as an energy hub, could then become more important. And of course, I need not say that Egypt is kind of the main hub in the region from the energy perspective, but potentially this could also really pull the region and make it more of relevance, particularly as we kind of look forward with the energy transition going up. I know that someone is talking about the Gaza situation, so I'm not going to talk about that, but happy to answer that in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Manal. So from the periphery to the de-peripheralization to making this an energy hub, let's talk about more differently.
Thanks, Othon. Well, the Eastern Mediterranean is an area rife with challenges, risks, and opportunities. Migration flows are a major challenge for the countries of the region, either because they host enormous numbers of migrants, like Turkey, Lebanon, and recently Egypt, which has made 5 to 6 million Africans in its territory from Sahel countries, ready to cross into Europe. And of course, migrants are also a concern for first reception countries like Italy and Greece. But the migration issue must be addressed not only because of demographic shifts and the explosion in Africa, as well as in other areas of the planet, which in combination with the climate crisis will create legions of migrants in the coming years, but also because of the aging of the European population and the need for Europe to welcome more Europeans, which of course has engendered and strengthened extremist groups across Europe that play to a domestic audience, cultivate fear and insecurity. The presence and spread of international terrorism, of transnational organized crime is also a source of concern for the region. There are also other interstate conflicts along with two countries that are considered dysfunctional, to put it gently, Libya and Lebanon. Meanwhile, in Syria, the Assad regime has stabilized, but the country is still a focus of crisis and confrontation, even between NATO partners, such as Turkey and the US. Unfortunately, for the past 15 years, the Cyprus problem has remained a prolonged, ongoing dispute without any serious progress or resolution in the foreseeable future. While the crisis in the Middle East, which I will refer to later, has shaken Turkey's relations with Israel, just when efforts were being made to normalize those relations. For the time being, Turkey is showing restraint towards Cyprus and Greece. Regarding the former, it maintains its tough stance in favor of cooperation, but it has not violated the Cyprus fundamental stand with seismic surveys or drillings as it did in the past. And in Greece's case, we have the only good news in the region. There is a moratorium on inflammatory statements and incendiary reactions. And this primarily concerns Turkey because the flow of Turkish tensions is regulated by Ankara. The two leaders, Erdogan and Anastasakis, are going to meet for the third time in just 5 months in Athens on the 7th of December and sign agreements on the so-called positive agenda, including on the migration issue, which has rocked our relations with Turkey since 2015. And in general, it seems that Turkey does not want to open a front with Greece, right now, for a number of reasons that we can get into during the Q&A. However, the fact that we have had almost no violations or overlaps of Greek airspace since last April, so it's almost 7 months, and that Erdogan is avoiding any negative reference to Greece while letting into the West on almost a daily basis, indicates a positive trend. The Eastern Mediterranean is, I would say, one side of a triangle that runs from Ukraine on the one hand and the Middle East on the other. So there are two crises underway with uncertain results that will certainly impact the stance of both regional and external actors. Ukraine created dividing lines, despite the fact that many countries that were considered allies or even strategic partners of the Americans maintained a neutral stance, not only because they think this was in their national interest, but also because of the rage and frustration that have built up from the choices the Americans have made in the region over the past 20 years. Allow me to digress a little and say that the intervention in Iraq, which strengthened Iran while it was on the axis of evil, and moreover was a competitor and even an enemy of most of the strategic allies of the US, the outbreak of the Arab uprisings, which a number of Arab leaderships blame on the effort of the Americans to change the status quo in the region, later the agreement on Iran's nuclear program, from which Trump withdrew, and finally the manner in which the US withdrew from Afghanistan, in combination with the sense that the US was turning its back in the Middle East region in general. So all of these proved detrimental to the relations between Washington and a number of Arab leaderships. The most difficult circumstance the US is facing in the Middle East right now is the consolidation of the view among Muslim and Arab communities that Washington is to blame for almost all of the rules. Thus, even in the current crisis, Washington, in spite of its fairly balanced approach, seems incapable of determining the outcome of the war. In short, US credibility and influence have been called into question. So to get back to Ukraine, the war there, following the Russian invasion, affected the region mainly economically and socially. It is no coincidence that Egypt and the Al-Sisi regime are facing serious domestic problems due to the economic crisis, much of which can be attributed to the war in Ukraine and the interruption of grain supplies, which forced Cairo, by the way, to enter into a bilateral agreement with Moscow in order to secure grain for its domestic market. There were similar negative impacts on other economies, depending in each case how fortified a given country's economy was. At the same time, of course, the war in Ukraine brought Eastern Mediterranean back to the forefront and high on the agenda as a source of energy supply and security for the European market, since it was decided to restrict imports from Russia. The companies involved, as well as the producer states and the European Union, saw a window of opportunity that led to a relevant agreement between Brussels, Cairo, and Tel Aviv in the summer of 2022. And the US, as said, supported this project and thus became more actively involved in regional energy-driven processes. The war that is raging in the Gaza Strip has certainly had a greater impact on regional power balances, and while it may not seem likely that it will alter them dramatically in the near future, it has nevertheless added a serious source of tension at a time when some believed or hoped that the situation in the Middle East was starting to normalize. And of course, there were good reasons for this hopes. On the one hand, the Abraham Accords and the recognition of the State of Israel, which might have culminated in an agreement with Saudi Arabia as well. And on the other hand, Saudi Arabia's agreement with Iran, mediated by China, as well as the delimitation of maritime boundaries between Israel and Lebanon, gave the impression that the worst was behind us. Of course, we had proxy conflicts in Syria and Yemen, and problematic situations in Iraq and Lebanon, and of course, the multi-dimensional problem with Iran and its nuclear program, while last summer the expectation was created that the US might return to the 2015 agreement. But in the end, we also had the complacency of the Israelis, which was a result of the growing reluctance of Arab leaderships to support the Palestinian cause, and the complacency of the US, which seemed to believe that the countries of the region could, on their own, create an environment of security and at least a minimum of understanding. Still, this could be achieved only on the basis of an agreement on commonly accepted rules that would create a framework of commerce and cooperation, and not just transactional. And of course, a necessary condition, and this has always been the case, it is simply even clearer now, is a solution to the Palestinian issue. In an optimistic scenario, because major crises bring major solutions, and because we might have to go through the worst to get to something better, there is a hidden hope for us optimists that we will see a settlement of the Palestinian issue, that relations between Israel and the Arab states will not be shaken, and that a way of achieving greater understanding and inclusiveness will be found. But in whose interest could this be, and how might they contribute in this direction? I'm referring to external actors. The United States is heading to elections, and in a few months, the president will be a lame duck. The European Union, unfortunately, does not have the sway or the determination to intervene effectively. China and Russia are more interested in damaging US's prestige and blaming Washington for the current situation. What's more, will broader consensus and settlements be south on other pending issues such as the Cyprus issue, while Turkey has made it clear that it is not discussing anything other than a two-state solution? What will happen with Libya and Lebanon, and how will the al-Sisi regime stand up in Egypt? In such an environment, is there room for a resolution of Turkish relations? And might Turkey's steady divergence from the West, which now has an air of permanence about it, affect its position in the region, making it much more popular in Muslim and Arab circles, but much less credible and more problematic for the West and its interests? And finally, to what extent can we talk about the US comeback in the region? What are the constants for the region? And how might the new regional power balances and the participation of China, discrete for the time being, underline, impact the situation? And finally, will Russia continue to behave like a spoiler power, capitalizing on instability, for example, in eastern Libya? Greece, and do I have 2 minutes? Yes. Thanks. Greece does not have the diplomatic sway to develop a substantial role, while there are players like Egypt and Jordan that have a long tradition of mediation, especially in the Palestinian issue. However, Athens can contribute to the creation of a regional coalition of states that will share common outputs and agree on mutually acceptable rules that define their relations and, by extension, regional developments. This can serve as an axis of stability, peace, and prosperity with projects that will bind the interests of states without exceptions, without exclusions, but also with strict requirements as to the framework of conduct and respect for the principles governing interstate relations. So anyone, for example, who favors the use of force to resolve problems or violates the territorial integrity of other states must find itself marginalized. So to conclude, as you can see, I have more questions than I do answers. In any case, I hope these questions will fuel the discussion.
Thank you very much for your time. Indeed. Many more questions. Gabby, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I think that Othon, you're not expecting me to answer any of these questions for all of them. I will be following basically where you left off, how the parameters of regional security is changing the contemporary regional security in the Mediterranean. And I think the three issue has been quite key when we discuss the regional security in the Mediterranean. One of them is in recent years, the Mediterranean has experienced a very significant level of regional reset, de-escalation, normalization. I know all of us were searching for the right words to describe it, but in any case, there was a de-escalation of tension, reduction in the tension. That has been an important factor. And when you look at another one has been obviously another one has been obviously the great power competition, because all this de-escalation has been taking place at a time when we talked about the competition between US and China on the one hand, perhaps not at the global level, but on a more regional level, the Russia and the US at the same time. And now, in the last 2 years, we have two major additions to it. Is a two war, first the Ukraine and now the Gaza. The regional normalization question was the optimistic one. And there was a different mode of this regional normalization. On the one hand, you had the regional normalization taking place at the nexus of Turkey, Arab and Gulf states, and Israel. And this regional normalization was supposed to have more impact for the regional security on the multiple level, particularly when it comes to Turkey-Israel normalization. The two aspects was coming to fore before the war. One of them was there was more talk about the possible cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean. We saw these meetings between Erdogan and Netanyahu in New York, and there was the talk of like the bilateral visits, Erdogan visiting Israel, Netanyahu visiting Turkey, already the Herzog visited Ankara. And not only in Eastern Mediterranean, but last is not less important was actually how these two countries were converging in South Caucasus. In South Caucasus, particularly during the Nagorno-Karabakh war, not only Turkey, but Israel strongly supported the Azerbaijan side, provided all the military equipment, drones, weapons to the Azerbaijan side. And you saw the emergence of an interesting nexus there between Turkey, Israel, and Azerbaijan. And obviously that was taking an increasing and over an anti-Iranian disposition, the new picture that was emerging there. The second reset or de-escalation was at the Eastern Mediterranean level, and obviously this was like what we are seeing with the Turkey-Greece level, and we don't hear this bombastic exchanges between the capitals, Israelis activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. So once again, the diplomacy is having a chance, at least the talks are taking the primacy over the grand posturing in Eastern Mediterranean. And actually one factor previously that motivated Turkey to de-escalate at the broader region level of the practice, one of them was actually to turn the Eastern Mediterranean crisis from a multilateral one between Turkey, a set of countries, including the Arab countries, Israel and Greece, to a bilateral one between Turkey and Greece. So in a sense, to create a decoupling between the Greece and then the Arab states and Israel in the during its crisis with Turkey. So that was one of the major motivation behind Turkey's energetic outreach previously, or more interest in normalizing with Egypt, in normalizing with Israel, and also even like in normalizing with countries like the UAE. Let's not forget, for some all of a sudden, we saw all these Gulf countries becoming part and parcel of the Eastern Mediterranean crisis. I mean, the Saudi Arabia or the UAE having like military drilling with Greece for Turkey, that was like quite negative. So one motivation for Turkey was to reduce the Eastern Mediterranean crisis, not a multilateral one between Turkey and a set of Arab countries, but to a bilateral one between Turkey and Greece, so that the coupling is. And recently we saw this de-escalation between Turkey and Greece as well, and that was another, in a sense, positive sign that was contributing, was expected at least, hope that will contribute into some form of de-escalation between Turkey and the EU level, because from Turkey perspective, the Greece question is very much also interlinked with Turkey's broader European question. In the end, the Eastern Mediterranean security is not only Turkey and Greece, it's a European security question. The third level, but there was also, in a sense, exception to this regional reset. That was on one level, the Israel-Iran one was the obvious exception. But I think there was another one up until October 7. There was more friction on the horizon between Turkey and Iran. There was more flashpoints were emerging between Turkey and Iran. So, and this was actually, as I mentioned previously, particularly the emerging convergence between Turkey, Israel, and Azerbaijan in southern Caucasus was decidedly and openly taking place in an anti-Iran fashion. And the implication of this reset were several things in the Eastern Mediterranean. You have quite many conflicts. Libya is the most obvious case because it was part and parcel of the Eastern Mediterranean crisis. I mean, let's remember in 2018, 1920s, particularly when Turkey and Libya signed the maritime deal that also triggered Egypt and Greece signing one. So right now, this de-escalation had an impact on the regional conflicts in Eastern Mediterranean. There is a de-escalation in Libya between Turkey, Egypt, and the UAE. More importantly, not any of the fundamental issues that create a Libyan crisis have been addressed or resolved, but there is a recognition or willingness among the external actors not to escalate the tension. So de-escalation is actually happening only the fact that the actors don't want to escalate, not any of the fundamental issues that created the crisis has been resolved. And also, let's not forget this de-escalation at the regional conflict zones are more about the external actors than the conflict zones themselves. And actually, this is coming at their expense. So the regional actors are negotiating their interests within these conflict zones without actually no regard to the local actors, or less regard to the local actors. We see this in Libya, we are seeing this in Syria. None of the fundamental issues that created the Syrian crisis has been addressed, but at the same time, we are seeing this happening. So that's the first one. The second thing, another implication of this process has been, like in recent years, we were talking about these different regional schemes, the regional pipeline projects. That was like, very much part of the point of conversation between Ankara and several of the countries in the region. For Ankara, that was actually more concerning. Not only a regional framework was emerging, but the idea was actually perhaps that might actually lead to a regional security order in a fashion that is decided by anti-Ankara. So from Turkey point of view, at this stage, this prospect has been prevented. I mean, the regional pipeline project probably was dead. I mean, Manal knows much better than I do, so that can not go into it. Probably it didn't make that much economic sense as well, but it was also geopolitically or politically was unviable, and particularly after now war in Gaza, I think if there was any faintest prospect of this realizing, it's that what I said. The second thing is, another implication, as we discussed, these drilling activities has stopped the regional energy exploration. I mean, the contestation at the Eastern Mediterranean, even though the name was the energy contestation, that was effectively about, the contestation of the different projection of the sovereignty, like the different actors' projection of their sovereignty in the Eastern Mediterranean. So energy was only a name of it. And as a result of this, there was recently more talk about what comes after de-escalation, what comes after normalization, because in the end, normalization and de-escalation are not an end in themselves. They were supposed to be ends, they were supposed to be means to other ends. And there, the question of the regional cooperation, different regional multilateralism, which was supposed to lead to regional multilateralism or cooperation, and how to bring EU into it. I mean, if you attended, the particular think tank meetings 3 months ago, that was a major search. I mean, I myself actually, right before the war started, I was speaking at Chatham House on a panel. The title was "Building Sustainable Regional Cooperation in the Middle East." So, and that was, I think, it was 2 days or 3 days after the Gaza war, after the Gaza war started. So you can see actually all these different search at the governmental level, at the think tank level. I don't know with how many foreign ministries or the think tanks I have engaged with, discussing what can be built around this regional de-escalation, so that we can have some form of a functional regional cooperation in these areas. And I think after this war in Gaza, at least for the foreseeable future, that has been severely undermined, unless, will come later, unless we have a new international momentum that will factor in very significantly the Palestinian question in, because in most of this regional cooperative framework, the missing part was Palestine, and even the Arab-Israeli normalization. One big missing part in this normalization was the Palestine, and actually the normalization was premised on the idea that the Palestinian issue is no longer one essential issue of the regions. It's no longer one of the 4 issues. The region has a much more important issue. Therefore, the Arab-Israeli normalization should be premised more on the bilateral interests of the both states, with limited regards, or if not no regards, to Palestine. So going forward, I think for this de-escalation normalization to have any future, it will have to, from now onward, will have to factor in the Palestinian question, and particularly if we are talking about the Saudi-Israeli normalization. For this normalization to have any legitimacy, it's not off the table. I mean, let's not make a mistake. I think the Saudis still want to keep on the table, but to be realized, it will now require to have a strong, significant Palestinian dimension. I think without strong and significant Palestinian dimension, the regional normalization effort between the Arab world and Israel is more or less going to remain a distinct prospect. Another factor of the region security was the trade power competition. I mean, previously when we discussed the trade power competition, I mean, more than China, we discussed actually Russia in the Mediterranean, because when you talk about the Russia's Middle East movement, that was also again very topical issues. I mean, we have Dimitar Becher here, another expert from Russia, wrote quite a lot on the Russia's policy everywhere in the world, but most importantly in Middle East, North Africa, because the Russian Middle East movement was very much Russian Mediterranean. I mean, where is Russia projecting its power? It was in Syria, September 2015. Russian intervention in Syria changed the course of the war and made sure that Assad remained in power. Even according to Russian source and Syrian sources, without the Russian intervention, the Assad fall was almost certain, according to many. So the Russia saved Assad, and then Russia became a major actor in Libya. Russia became like a player in Eastern Mediterranean. And if you go a bit like down in the Mediterranean, Russia has very close historical relation with Algeria. Russia had very close relation with Egypt. So Russia's Middle East moment is effectively was Russia's Mediterranean moment. Russia leveraged its role in Mediterranean for broader engagement with the region. The first Saudi king that visited Russia is the current Saudi. Like its role in the Mediterranean facilitated Russia's engagement with the broader Middle East, most importantly with the Arab Gulf states, and that's how you see actually the Russia engaging with different frameworks. You have this OPEC plus framework, the energy framework between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and despite the war in Ukraine, despite many pressure from the US, that framework still survives to the day. But what should we anticipate about the Russia's future in the region? I think despite the many expectations, because after the Russian invasion, there was more expectation what will happen to Russian role in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. Thus far, Russia has largely clung onto its role. So Russia largely maintained its role in these regional conflict zones. It has, it had to adjust a bit, like in Syria, it had created a bit more ground for Iran to play a role. But largely in Syria and Libya, Russia maintained its position. But Russia's bargaining power or leverage vis-a-vis the regional actors has diminished. Because in the end, the question of dependency or interdependency between Russia and the regional actors is not a static one. It's a dynamic one, and it's redefined by each and every single event. The Ukraine war has given more advantages to the regional regional actors. But going forward, I personally anticipate relative reduction or gradual reduction in Russia's regional role. The pressure on Russian resources in Ukraine is one factor. The lackluster performance of the Russian weaponry, because the weapon was one of the Russia's main engagement with the region. Just look at with Turkey, S-400s was the major sort of presence with the West. That is also another factor. So going forward, I do anticipate a relative reduction in the Russian place and presence in the Middle East, but for the time being, Russia maintaining, and I think that this intent with the US also makes many regional countries to continue with the relation with Russia as a result of this intent. The China is Russia came as a security actor. Russia is mainly a security actor in the region, but it tried to leverage or translate its role into economic spheres through different engagement with the region. China is mainly an economic actor. And now we see whether Chinese can translate its economic power into the other areas. Recently, we saw, China playing this Saudi-Iran things, but that was more or less there was the ground already paid. So the China was the one that actually attested. So it's still the Chinese question is more important. But what is important for China is China is not like unlike Soviet Union is not exporting any model. But China itself is a model not for people, but for the regional dictators. China is the model for the success that the regional dictators failed, because China, in a sense, addressed the question of legitimacy in a way that the regional dictators like. Because for a long time, the question of legitimacy from the liberal point of view or from the other point of view, we said like the regional actors, the regional regime has to be inclusive, open up, like create more political space. China says, no, you don't have to do any of that. The question of legitimacy can be addressed by the developmentalism. So if you develop, if you economically progress, you really don't have to engage in any political reforms, and your legitimacy or the sustainability of your region will be sustained. So in this regard, China is an appealing factor, and that's why I think the engagement with China will not reduce until we have a big new bargaining between the Middle East and the US, which is not on the horizon at the same time. So the most very final thought is, I think one important thing in the Eastern Mediterranean for the future of the region security in the Eastern Mediterranean is whether Turkey and EU will be competitive or cooperative in region security. Whether the Turkish and European role in the region security will be more competitive or cooperative is very crucial for the Mediterranean security, and that's very difficult. I know. So unlike let's say like Central Asia or Balkans or South Caucasus, where I see like the prospect of more cooperation in Eastern Mediterranean, particularly because of the nature of the dispute between Turkey and Greece, and from Turkey's point of view, Ankar's point of view, EU is not part of the solution but part of the problem in the issue, because EU effectively or inherently or structurally will be by the side of Greece and Cyprus. So therefore, this is a very important question. But whether the Eastern Mediterranean will have a pragmatic security picture or not, very much also depends whether the EU and Turkey can find a way. So there's the role in the Eastern Mediterranean will not be confrontational or competitive. Some form of accommodation is found there. And the final point is the people element of region security, but we can see it later.
There are people in the region as well. But thank you very much. That was a massive mapping of the region. I think that we have open kind of on a number of issues that you are welcome now to ask your questions. And I've already seen a demo that wanted to ask the question. Yes.
Yeah, two questions actually, and one comment. I agree with Khalid that Russia is probably on the way down. First, because the Russian Black Sea fleet is focused in the Black Sea and Straits are closed. Crimea was the base for sincerity and not targets. Secondly, Cyprus has downgraded seriously its relationship, but I think most importantly, Russia is tied its horses to Iran. It's much more dependent on Iran now, so it cannot be this power in the middle, right? I mean, and also we see it in Gaza now with Hamas being not striking a balance, but going in one direction. But as Russia, my question is about the EU really, and we talk about you in aggregate terms, but how about the different member states that play a role? And that's a question to everyone, and there are three particular probably are very relevant, and I'm just curious to see what you think of them. One is France. I mean, France, of course, now in Gaza, Macron was the first one to take a position and criticize the European Commission. But also France is involved in security, aligning with Greece and balancing Turkey on the naval side. Total is there in Cyprus in prospecting for gas and oil. So France is a key player, and Italy is another key player. In Libya, but not only in Egypt, because you mentioned Egypt exploration. Eni is the one. Eni is developing the field, and that's one of the examples that gas and oil has come to the market, actually, the Egyptian domestic market, but Italy has delivered. And Italy is a big player on the Turkish market. It's not the diplomatic great power, but economically, it's a heavyweight in this region. So I'll be curious to know. And finally, since we are mentioning gas, I mean, what are the chances of gas and oil just staying buried there, not being recouped and not coming online?
Let's have some more, because there are other questions. Well, please write them down.
Okay, I have an energy question, which is a strange thing to say since I'm a person. But I knew that Egypt had significant gas resources, but I was really unaware of how significant those resources were until I heard your talk. It hasn't kept the country from coming close to bankrupting itself through its crazy mega projects, but I mean that's only of relevance, I guess, to what you're talking about, to the extent that it might have some impact on Egypt's. I mean, it's more precarious than it should be, so it might have some impact on its capacity to further develop those resources. But I wanted to ask you to talk a bit about Egypt's gas resources in the context of the growing impetus, maybe it's just rhetoric, about decarbonization. Does that make Egypt's resource more valuable because it's a relatively clean fossil fuel, or less valuable, or at least time limited because there seems to be growing pressure for energy to be generated by some means other than fossil fuels, and it's still a fossil fuel given it's clean.
Thank you.
Hi, this is a comment and a question at the end for everyone. It was interesting to hear from all of you the complexity of the region and how through that complexity it can be hopeful, the potential can be hopeful, cooperation, economic cooperation, etc., or it could go up, because this is what the relations in the region are like. And there is a context within which all of the relations are playing out, and that's the context of international law. So I was interested to hear, for example, your presentation, Alex, where you even mentioned the TRNC as an actor. And I have to say that, you know, in international law, the TRNC is not a void, and all states are called upon not to facilitate or recognize. The Commission, the European Commission, does have programs for the support of the Turkish community within the international law remits and the acquis communautaire. So the relationships are there, they're complicated, but we cannot operate outside of international law. And even the deal with Israel and Lebanon, that accepted the basic tenet of UNCLOS. So the limits of the delimitation between Israel and Lebanon was according to the International Convention. Even the maps, it was interesting to see that the maps by
Manal.
were according to UNCLOS. The maps that were shown in your presentation, Alex, were something different. Yeah. So if we're to speak the same language and work on the potential for cooperation, we need to speak that same language under the international law context. And that takes me to the Turkey relations that were touched upon by the other two speakers. I was surprised to see that Cyprus was pretty much non-existent in the presentation on the Turkey relations from you, whereas it's quite central to the EU-Turkey dialogue, and one of the criteria for those relations to go forward in December is for certain things to happen. So I guess to everyone, how much does international law play into your analysis? And yeah, I would be interested to hear.
Okay, let's address these questions first, starting from Alex, Manal, Constantinos, and Gareth, and then we'll go to the other round.
Yeah, I think with Russia, I think just to back to the question, I agree. I actually think that we need to also think of the activeness of various people involved. I don't think you can now, I mean, the Black Sea, when we speak of Eastern Mediterranean, we were always used to think of the Black Sea as a kind of safe place that's been dealt with. And the Black Sea is now a complete zone of insecurity. And what we're seeing to involve the Black Sea is being close to the tanker war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s. And then in a broader sense, I think this is going to affect calculations, particularly in the Sahel, but also people. You already see Ukrainian special operations forces in Sudan. I think there's a lot of evidence that they're operating in Central Africa. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're in Syria. So the basic calculation of the regional actors to make, beyond the ones that you mentioned, is if we hire the Russians to guard our front gate today, the Ukrainians will show up and put a bomb in our outhouse tomorrow. Right? Because everywhere the Russians are, the Ukrainians will show up building. And actually that will get worse if the front lines in Ukraine freeze, because the conflict will not stop if there's no resolution. It will just get externalized into security services wars across the region. Right, so I think that's something to keep in mind. And I think in that sense, I think we've often done these overcorrections with Russia. So Russia gets dismissed as an actor for very long, and suddenly it shows up, oh, they're going to take everything over. And I think we have to, Russia has a limited set of levers, and has a limited set of options, and it runs those options very well. It's actually something I would also say that Turkey is also subject to an analytical overcorrection. I think Turkey is having, I think Erdogan also has the space that he's won the election. He's under less domestic pressure. He has more freedom of action, right? And he doesn't have to speak to a domestic audience where he's increasingly anchored his rule over his compromise, the MHP and the verbals and all that comes with it. But it's still a fragile economy, and for all of the kind of geopolitical ambitions that he has, its manufacturing sector and services and financial sector is still largely integrated in the EU customs union. So again, this is an interesting disconnect between economic comment. You look where you will look at Turkey and say, this is our Mexico, right? And the geopolitical dimension where, oh, this is something that's pressuring us. And so there's a disconnect here that I don't think is permanent. I think it's going to break at some point. And the question is, I think that's where Greece and in a way Cyprus will have to hold the rein in this environment when those tensions go up. I mean, and I agree with you that the key for Turkey is Athens. Once you open Athens up, and maybe Rome as well, because these towns are quite Turco-Islander friendly, it opens up. Finally, on the point of international law, I think international law only matters in the case of Cyprus because Cyprus is in the Commission. Right? Cyprus is in a position which it would not be to be able to block things and slow things down. I think that's why I agree with you. I think international law should be accepted. I do think also see the strong impulses in Brussels to resolve Cyprus. If we solve this thing, everything will follow. And I can certainly get the Greek Cypriot or Cypriot state like skepticism about what this all involves in relation to TRNC. But what means international law matters is because you have power, right? If you don't have power, and also, look at Idlib, right? Jilani is an ex-Al-Qaeda guy, and there's no stance for international law with that, but every security service has appointed him. Like, nobody gives a crap about international law when it comes to Idlib, because the guy's useful. So I think that what means, the reason international law matters in your case is because you have power.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start with a short comment before answering Dima's question about gas and oil. When we were talking also about Russia's role in all of this, as well as, kind of, you said the moment for Russia to engage in the Middle East was really a Mediterranean moment, and I think we're maybe overestimating the role of Russia here and underestimating the role of Gulf states in basically, one, being very pragmatic, and then two, the role of the US really kind of becoming a lot weaker in the region, leaving a vacuum where the Gulf states, ahead of them, Saudi Arabia, at the head, kind of the de facto, so to speak, leader, really just not so much because Russia was, I think, in the region, it was just very much what is the best in our interest, where can we get, whether it's China or Russia or whomever, support, and also there's a lot of ambition to kind of come really as really a regional country leading in the region, as well as obviously the oil situation. So there's a big part of this, not so much was Russia's involvement in the Mediterranean as much as we really, from the Gulf perspective, the focus on oil prices not going down and the importance of keeping relations in the OPEC plus with Russia that I think are driving. And I think it's important to kind of put this in the context of maybe not overestimating the Russian role in this as much as the energy part that also is driving the local geoeconomic and geopolitical relations. And on the gas and oil, would they be underground? This is actually really interesting because there's also, whether true or not, there's already now after the October 7th, even newspaper articles that claim that Israel is already kind of drilling from gas fields, and whether that is true or not, I haven't verified it, but I do not necessarily think that they will remain underground, even if the Palestinian Authority of some level, whether represented, whoever representing the Palestinians, I think there's a lot of natural resources there that will be tapped into. And I think this leads into the third question about the international law and UNCLOS, because Israel has not signed UNCLOS. Neither has Turkey or Syria. So we're looking at an area where even there's a lot of economic opportunity, and with Israel kind of threatening to completely potentially take over Gaza, I think it could have access to those fields, and I don't think that will necessarily not be access there or remain underground, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, for whomever's accessing them. But on the question of Egypt, I think this is a really important question, because Egypt has both oil as well as gas reserves or resources onshore as well as offshore, as well as in Sinai. So you can think of really Egypt really is kind of, the whole Mediterranean region, the Eastern Med, but specifically Egypt really squished. There's Algeria and Libya, and then there's the Gulf here, and it's really gotten a lot of those natural resources. The gas is not used so much for decarbonization. It's very much, and I think this is very much an attitude for the Eastern Med in general, even though gas is the cleaner fossil fuel than oil, and it has been used for decarbonizing a lot of the energy systems. I think there is bigger urgency to try to exploit as much of that gas as possible, not just in Egypt, but in the region, before we have rules, for example, in Europe to not use dirty fossil fuels, so to speak. So and the fact that it's cleaner than oil gives it a push. So I think there is really, from the local region, there is a race towards who can exploit their natural resources faster, and also using it in domestic market. And Egypt here is where it becomes really interesting, the role of gas, because Egypt, as you very well know, with over 100 million in population and very large needs for domestic energy, domestically, both residential but also industrial, a lot of the gas has been used for domestic quote unquote self-sufficiency, but then the price that the subsidized gas locally is going to be a fiscal burden, while the export of the gas is a fiscal revenue. So there's challenges where can you maximize the revenue of gas, and there has been a lot of investments from other parts, even in the region, Saudi Arabia, for example, UAE, into Egypt. But Egypt, nonetheless, is trying to maximize the decarbonization front with really large investments in renewable energy, for example. And part of that is really, and also looking at becoming exporters of hydrogen, mostly from renewable energy, so green hydrogen, not from the gas. I think the gas is still seeing how can we free up part of the gas from domestic consumption and use renewable energy domestically, and then use more of the gas for exports. And as I said, so far, Egypt has the only LNG capability in the region, which allows it to then export even, gas from Israel, for example, that is liquefied and then shipped into Europe.
Yeah, concerning France's role, you do know that we have signed with France defense agreement, and actually there is a clause in Article 2 saying that if Greece's sovereignty is in danger, France will step in. Whether this is going to happen, well, I hope that we don't have to find out. However, for France, from a French perspective, Turkey is the biggest competitor, not only in the Eastern Mediterranean, but in Africa as well. Because the French role in Africa is diminishing, and the Turkish role in Africa has been upgraded. Actually, I consider Turkey in the wider Africa to be, in the African continent, to be ranking third after China and the US in terms of presence, for sure. Turkish Airlines does a very good job for Turkish interests. There is interaction between Turkey and many African states, so it seems that for France, Turkey is the competitor, and France does everything it can to make sure that Turkey's role is not going to further enhance in the wider Caribbean. Of course, France has energy interests as well. In Cyprus, in Greece, Total was engaged, but it dropped out from our energy program. But still, the French are there; they're present as friends. Italy, of course, is another key player, as you said. For me, although we feel as Greeks very close to the Italians, when it comes to foreign policy, be it the Mediterranean or the Balkans, we are competitive powers. And I don't see many in Greece's public discourse stressing that point, but that is for me the truth. Apart from the fact that the Italians are really close to Turkey and they have a very close defense cooperation with the Turks. Regarding Egypt, let me just add something. Because of the internal needs, Egypt have been importing natural gas from Israel for quite some time, and this was the first year after 3 years that Egypt produced very low quantities of natural gas. So yes, it has a comparative advantage of the two LNG facilities in Kuwait and Damietta compared to other regional players, but still there is a point of concern as to whether Egypt, because it needs subsidized prices for the internal market, whether Egypt will be at last in a position to export quantities of natural gas, as Israel, for instance, can. And of course, let us not forget that the other elephant in the regional room, as a regional player, big regional market is Turkey. Turkey can very easily absorb something between 8 to 10 billion cubic meters on an annual basis, but it cannot be regarded, even from a European perspective, as it is not a very credible partner. It cannot be regarded as a country through which natural gas can be transported to the European market. Anyways, it seems to me that for the Eastern Mediterranean, the future is LNG and not pipelines. If there is any future, given that the European Union is very strict and has made it very clear that natural gas is not considered to be the fuel that will bridge between nowadays situation and this green transition. At least not for much time. And quickly, yes, international law. As you know, the limitation of maritime zones, we have one between Cyprus and Egypt, another one between Cyprus and Israel. Of course, yes, Israel does not is not part of UNCLOS, but still there is customary law that prevails. We have another agreement between Cyprus and Lebanon that has not been ratified by the Lebanese parliament. And we have two new agreements, one between Greece and Egypt, and another one between Turkey and Libya, which we consider to be null and void and illegal based on Libya. We also have drillings either in disputed areas, which is also illegal on behalf of Turkey, south of Castellorizo, and of course within Cyprus's exclusive economic zone and by extension continental shelf. I don't see any agreement, any new agreement in the limited maritime zones in the region, which means that if we look into the map, the biggest part of it is disputed still between states, and that has, of course, an impact on energy projects as well on the side of the conflict.
Thank you. My struggle as a chair is to try and contain as much as possible, not get more questions. Yes, Gary, with this in mind.
Well, let me start with international law. I'm not, a legalist or a lawyer, but what I know, just looking at the recent, right now, war in Gaza occupation. What I know, almost every single Western human rights call upon their governments to urge Israel to abide by the international law, including the UN Secretary General, almost including all the countries in the non-Western world. But simply, the West just disregarded and sidestepped it, and I don't think that anyone will, for a long time, listen to the international law conversation or rule-based organization coming from the West. So I don't think for major questions the international law yet it's a reference point, the talking point. One day probably some of these issues will be resolved by this, but I think major geopolitical question is not going to be resolved by the international law framework, because first and foremost, agreeing on the international law framework is not an easy thing. On this one, from the Turkey level, there was a UN process, obviously, where both sides agreed upon, and 2004, and the fault is that, we basically voted yes, and then the Greek part voted no, but in the end, we got punished, and the European basically failed on their promise on this one. And what all the indicators that I see is the two-state solution is not an Erdogan policy or not a government policy. This is actually more or less a policy where you see quite consensus at the state level and almost forward to the parties level. So, what that means, how that means, I don't know, but I don't see a different direction. So I think that's the direction more or less, right? And that's the course more or less that I see is forward. And that's why, despite all the de-escalation we are seeing this, we might see actually a re-escalation, because the framework between the both sides of resolving this conflict is so glaringly wide apart from each other. Secondly, the France question. To some extent, I think that the problem between Turkey and France is not they're so dissimilar to each other. I think that they're also on many level geopolitically very similar to each other. Here we have two post-imperial states with an ideal grandeur, with a kind of sense of quest, almost ever-present quest for status in international affairs, and despite the fact being regional powers, having global exploration, and that there is gap between these two things, and that creates anxiety. The trouble between the two countries, they are projecting power or influence in very similar zones in the same space, Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, etc. And this is how you see actually, for instance, from the France's point of view, when they engage in conversation in Paris, the Turkish role in Africa is much more rejected than the Russian role. Like, I mean, we saw this occurrence in Libya, I mean, part and parcel, France was in a sense effectively in alliance with Russia in Libya, on the side of the Khalifa Haftar, and against more or less the general consent at the EU level and the US level. And so therefore, for instance, I see more prospect for Turkey and the US or Turkey and Britain to work together in Africa. I mean, just look at the corner of Africa there, because the US is the main problem as China. So in this regard, I think despite all the crises that we see in Turkish-US relationship, probably the US or the Britain might see the Turkish role as more beneficial than the Chinese role. But I think with France, Turkey, I see more competition in North Africa and you know, in the West, in the French Africa. So more competition with Turkey, French, because the French sense of that it's losing ground in Africa is very strong there. And I think on the US side, finishing it, the US side, I mean, that's exactly right. The problem with the US in the region is not the US is downsizing its role in the region. I think the problem when you talk to the regional elites is the perception, whether it's right or not, the perception that the US is unpredictable, unreliable. For instance, the thing with Russia is the fact, you know, you agree on piecemeal with Russia, but you know each other's limitations. Like, you know each other, so you don't expect much. So there is more delivery in a sense in the it's transactional, it's limited, but it's that. With the US, the idea is unreliable, unpredictable. And as long as this is the prevalent perception among the regional elite, I think be it Russia, be it China, be it other the non-regional actors, they will try to they will try to increase their option as much as possible.
Okay. Eleanor.
I only have a very short question. First question is, to what extent may the next European election may game changer in the region? First question. Second question, you mostly talk about states, but is there any role to be played by the civil society in the stabilization of the region?
Okay, I think you want to speak about this. Yes. Right, David, I'll get all the questions.
Thank you.
So write them down, please.
Italy has been mentioned a number of times. I mean, unlike Greece or Cyprus, it doesn't have absolutely direct geopolitical role in the region. Again, France is different because it's the European country. But what precisely is Italy's role? And given also the history with Italy through Venice, having played a big role there. What's its role?
Yes.
Will the Gaza war affect the geopolitics of Middle East, Mediterranean, and in which way?
Which one? Gaza. Yeah.
Gaza war.
That's the question, right? Okay.
Yeah, earlier, Alex, you mentioned the difference between strategic culture and strategic power. Could you speak to the fact of where does Frontex play in entertaining strategic ambiguity with the NDICIs and how that agency sometimes reverts it? So if you could clarify, that would be great.
Okay, and my co-conspirator, George, because we are working together on this project.
I just wanted to, talk about the US because I had, as has been mentioned, because I wanted to, I was having a private discussion with a renowned former national security advisor. I won't share her name, but she portrayed herself as very instrumental in trying to find a peace solution that involved the entire region. And the takeaway was that, and she gave me the example of the East Med gas forum where it's everybody but Turkey, and the takeaway was that Turkey was a great disruptor. And I wanted to ask if you agree with this assessment, and if you do, and I'm not saying you have to, why does Turkey prefer to play unilaterally or at best bilaterally instead of multilaterally?
Yeah, and as a follow-up to this, Karen, if you can explain also why Turkey chooses to fix the relations with Greece, but not with the EU. Okay, so let's go the other way now, and we've got 10 minutes, so bear this in mind. Let's start with Karen.
Well, I mean, previously, let me start with your question. I mean, the honeymoon in Turkey-Greece relationship previously actually took place against the backdrop of improvement in Turkish relations. For a long time, Turkey-Greece relationship, it was a sub-file of Turkey-EU relations. Because back then, there was like more EU membership aspiration, more realistic prospect for more integration with the EU. I mean, look at the German and Papandreou era, and then the early period of the Erdogan's government. I mean, no statesman probably in Turkish history was willing to go as further in accommodation with Greece than Erdogan. I mean, it was the only Turkish, as far as I know, the only Turkish prime minister or president that openly stated that it's open and willing to engage in a land swap. I don't know any land swap for a peace. So I don't know any other Turkish president, or I don't remember any other Turkish president, prime minister that has done it. And that was against the backdrop of, again, like Turkey EU prospect. This was a period, basically, the Turkey was hoping that further integration into EU was possible. But this EU prospect is finished, or at least like further integration. And obviously, it's finished now, like, all this like demographic regression, authoritarianism, etc. But Turkey EU prospect was actually finished when Turkey, in essence, was experiencing one of its most reformist periods. Not when Turkey become like more authoritarian. That's, retrospectively, that became like more justification for further terminating the relationship. But when was the Turkey EU prospect really was killed? It was more or less 2004, 5, 6, 7. It was the time when actually what EU reform package after Manal was entered. The Germans said like no matter what, more or less, not membership, but let's discuss this within the Polish partnership framework. That was like the position of Angela Merkel. The Sarkozy of the France said like no matter what, we'll take this through, etc. We'll veto it, and Netherlands, etc. So in a sense, this prospect, in a very funny way, actually was killed. Not when Turkey became authoritarian, when actually finally Turkey was experiencing one of its most reformist periods. So in a sense, when you look at it from Turkey, it's almost sometimes looks as if like EU prefers an authoritarian, finds it easier to deal with an authoritarian Turkey than democratic Turkey, particularly for certain quarters. Not obviously there are like many, the EU wants a democratic Turkey, many part of Europe, EU and Europe, but there is a significant part probably finds it more easier. And that's why right now the Turkey-Greece file largely significantly decoupled from the EU level. It's more about the Eastern Mediterranean security and de-escalation with EU, not EU membership framework or not in EU integration framework. So that's the first part. Secondly, the Gaza question, how it affects the region geopolitics significantly, dramatically. One thing, I mean, everyone talks about whether this war will regionalize. And when they say this, they usually means that state level regionalization. And when they say it, they usually means like, will Hezbollah enter the war? And if Hezbollah fails, then Iran will enter the war. So in a sense, when they talk about the regionalization, will we see the Gaza war go into a direction in which Iran and its regional network will engage in a war with Israel? That's less likely. Despite all the rhetoric coming from Tehran, they are very calculated. But the Gaza war is being regionalized in another direction, the people level. This is a regional issue right now at the people level. And if this war continues, and if the invasion deepens and becomes long-lasting, I think we will see the Gaza or the Palestine becoming a significant magnet for the regional or international fighters. We will see the coming of the fighters into this scene. Because given the symbolism of Palestine, Jerusalem, Quds, Masjid al-Aqsa, all of them will prove much more powerful in attacking the foreign fighters than Syria, than Libya, than anywhere. So I mean, just look at those conflict zones. So if this war becomes a long-lasting one, be prepared. This will, irrespective of whether it becomes regionalized at the state level, it will become regionalized at the people level. And there is also prospect some of the regional countries might lose the control over their border if this becomes the case, or if it's going to return to that. The civil strategy, and exactly that is the most explosive part of the regional security. Everything that we talk about is the elite level. We forget about the people. Almost all the factors that lead to Arab Spring become aggravated. There is what I see right now, once again, the anger accumulation at the regional level. If there is any accumulation at some stage, there will be another explosion. When, I don't know. But all the indicators that I see, the weakest part of the region security, there is no human element. There is no civil society element there. So that's, and then finally, multilateral or bilateral, to your question.
Or unilateral.
Huh?
Or unilateral.
Oh, sorry, unilateral. I think that was the condition within which, in a sense, you know, I mean, it's some certain, it's regional, it's not like, you know, in essence, a principle of Turkish foreign policy. I mean, just look at Caucasus, Turkey always come up with this different formula of 3+2 or 3+3 or 3+3, or even like, you know, in Central Asia, Caucasus, Balkans, I see Turkey and the West actually working more independent, also in Africa. I mean, recently I was on a visit in Africa, when we talked to them. This is very specifically in Eastern Mediterranean. This there. And this was like to some extent the regional unilateralism and multilateralism was a product of Arab Spring. Because the Turkish stance on the Arab Spring has culminated in pitting Turkey against with a set of Arab countries, Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc. And that made all these countries to align with Greece and Cyprus in its dispute with Turkey. So this was more or less an Arab Spring contestation. And now, once again you see that Turkey engages them, that actually lessen these countries' commitment to the previously existing Eastern Mediterranean framework.
Thank you, Karen.
Turkey saw formations like these 3+1 platforms, Greece, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, as an attempt, particularly by Greece, and not by Israel or Egypt, to create a kind of a cordon sanitaire in the Eastern Mediterranean against Turkey. And if you talk to Turks, they will say that the main reason they had this peculiar and illegal, for me, agreement with Libya was in retaliation in response to what was happening in the Eastern Mediterranean against them. Well, what they forget is that they were the ones that destroyed the relations both with Egypt and Israel, with the latter since 2010 and with Egypt after 2013, because Turkey, of course, invested in the Arab uprisings, hoping that it would secure its position in the wider periphery through Muslim Brotherhood governments, starting from Libya or even Tunisia up to Syria. But that plan failed. Turkey realized the dire consequences of this policy against Israel and against Egypt, and of course is trying, as said, to restore its ties with both of them, although we see the damage in its ties with Israel, despite the fact that Erdogan is critical mainly of Netanyahu and reason, and not against Israel so much. But he wants to address the Muslim and the Arab societies, although Turkey is not an Arab country. He prefers to do that to patronize them, which of course creates further friction in Turkey's relations with Israel. Regarding Italy, for me, Italy's involvement in the region has three dimensions. First is energy, we talked about it. Second is migration. You do know that Italy is very much interested in migration growth, mainly from Libya. And I can still recall this agreement between Berlusconi and Gaddafi 15 years ago with his Buga partners. And all this personal stuff, because you do know better than I how personal foreign policy can become. And the third dimension is defense agreements. Italy has a defense industry, a notable defense industry, and it has defense agreements with many countries, namely Turkey, but also Greece. So the fact that Italy is not presented or portrayed as a regional power, I think that is to the benefit of Rome for obvious reasons. And the last point about the US. And US and Turkey is not a trustworthy partner for the US But of course, it is too big to be ignored, and the Americans in their ideal world would like Turkey to become once again Turkey of 2003, 2004. In my mind, Turkey will not return to these years, this honeymoon, as said with the EU, but with the US as well. It seems to me that Turkey, and it's not Erdogan is just the phenomenon, but it's something that characterizes Turkish political elite now that it has this new identity. Turkey feels that it can become an autonomous power, an autonomous regional power with global aspirations. Of course, as said, there is a gap between its aspirations and its potential, but still, it seems to me that Turkey feels that the more it diverges from the West and it keeps its distance, the better it is for its profile and its status, especially to the audiences that it wants to address, like the Muslims and the Arabs. It's something for me that we have to stress, that Turkey, despite being a NATO member, has been much more vocal, outspoken against Israel and the West than any other Arab state which is more heavily involved in the Palestinian issue.
Okay, you've got 5 minutes, otherwise you will not have dinner.
Okay, I'm going to run dinner. I'm hungry, so I'll stick to my 5 minutes. Maybe I'll start with
Not
the.
all the 5 minutes for you.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
I will share them. Maybe I'll start with the Italy role. In addition to what was already said, when the Eastern Med Gas Forum was signed, Italy was a founding member, and even when the members kind of disagreed with the Turkish-Libyan alliance, also Italy was there, and Italy was through an ENI, the partially oil and gas company, partially owned by the Italian government. They also started some of the initial discoveries of gas. So I think Italy has indeed a big role in a way, also kind of stabilizing the market, even though it's kind of behind the scenes. We don't really look at it as as a threat per se, but also for any potential exports or even trade of the new, for example, clean hydrogen or whatever, all of that will be going from the Middle East to Europe, will have to be passing through Italy as well. So that's also a role that I think Italy is kind of invested in addition, obviously, to the military part that was also mentioned earlier. With the US, this is the quote that you said, US was a great disruptor in the context of the pipeline, but also I think Turkey was pretty much kind of originally excluded out of that anyway. And I think part of that because of, what it claims to be part of what belongs to it from Cyprus is considered also European waters. And this is going back to the earlier question about the international law, where there's still a lot of disagreement. So I think it's potentially a little bit of both. And I would say that Turkey was, I would argue, very upset that it was excluded as well. So I think it wasn't just as a disruptor, but also intentionally excluded, and maybe kind of what was said about the US looking at Turkey as not with a lot of confidence. The Gaza war indeed did very much, I agree, change the geopolitics of the region. And I think for the people, kind of building up on what you're saying, I think the people have, I think we need to, we often think of the Arab world or the region as really kind of just an only Muslim world, and I think we need to remember that it's not, and the interest in the larger region is not a Muslim interest. However, there is also an element of the geopolitics that, because people are really kind of having, the Arab side at least, mostly distrust vis-a-vis Europe and the US, but also from governments, some of the geopolitics won't change. I think the Gulf states will continue to try to have normalization, that even with Saudi, even if it's not announced, it will still, behind the scenes, certain things will not necessarily change, and the region doesn't want to change that either. And on the last point on the civil society, I think this is a very, very good point where unfortunately there's a huge scope that is very much untapped in the area. And I think the region has more that binds it than that doesn't. And I think if we look at various areas where the civil society, even for example, in the Gaza-Palestine situation, where there were a lot of elements from the civil society that was able to drive a lot of progress, I think unfortunately in the region there is a big role, but it is not yet tapped into. And I'll leave it at that.
I'll go this from Alex, let's say, Barak came all the way from London, a very good question.
Very good question. First of all, thank you very much. I'd like to just amplify a point that you made. And I'd like to be as well counterintuitive. We take it as an axiom that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict it has a huge geopolitical impact. Haven't seen any significant impact on energy or financial markets. I think it's also connected to civil society, despite the symbolism of the Palestinian issue. We've not seen any outcry on the Arab streets. We have seen it on the Western streets. And so while civil society taps into grassroots activism here in the West, you don't see that in the Middle East. And therefore, I think that the media loves to consume it, but is it a red herring? Is it something which we are placing a disproportionate amount of attention to, but it doesn't have any impact on any forms of energy, finance, or even geopolitical security? I personally don't see it.
Yes.
I absolutely agree. I think this is where I disagree with Phil Palance. There's two things to disagree on. First of all, I think Gaza takes up all the oxygen, and it becomes projection space for the domestic agendas of various Western American actors. And in that sense, it gets massively, it's a geopolitical and security imports gets massively inflated. Gaza becomes a global security crisis, it becomes a Sinai crisis. And that only happens if you have Gazan refugees pushed into Sinai. The Egyptian government will do everything, including shooting Gazans, to stop that. If it turns into a Sinai crisis, that's a different level issue. I think the problem with Gaza is it's actually covering up a lot of other dynamics that are very, very interesting and actually far more risky. If we speak of civil society, I think what's happening in Soweto right now is very, very interesting, and nobody will pay attention to what is happening in Gaza, because what's happening in Soweto shows the weakness of the Assad regime, the extent to which the Russians and Iranians cannot keep the Druze down. Nobody can keep the Druze down, but that's another story, right? And you can see all of these kinds of dynamics. You can see, basically a kind of irredentist agenda being promoted by the Houthis. I mean, the Saudis are going to get screwed over, and I think they're going to go push inside. These are all things you have to pay attention to, as well as what's happening in Sudan, where the civilian casualty rates in Sudan are horrific, absolutely horrific. So I think the problem with Gaza is it eats up the oxygen for actually, armies can win insurgencies. The Israelis will destroy Hamas. The idea that Hamas can sit there in their bunkers and just win is, I think, deeply problematic. On Italy, Italy's greatest strategic advantage is that it has no delusions of grandeur, right? It has an elite that doesn't give a crap about looking cool. It has an elite that just wants to get its stuff done.
They're fashionable.
Yeah, exactly. They're fashionable. And also, if you go anywhere across the region, you will find Italian intelligence security service operators moving fast. And as a final point, so they're there and they have far more influence over defaults than Japan. Finally, on Turkey, we've made all these discussions about Turkey without looking at Turkey's financial and fiscal situation, right? Turkey can only project power off the basis of a particular degree of economic stability. Take that away, and I think Turkey's back to the 1980s, right? And we're back to a situation where Turkey's going to Brussels with a cap in hand. So I think that we're having an overcorrection now of Turkey grandeur, where that can tip very quickly if the Turkish central bank loses control of the situation. On strategic direction of the culture, I'll just simply say the EU has a strategic culture, it approaches certain things, influences everything around it, but it has very, very narrow central capacity, which means active like Frontex develops outsized power. It's very easy to build an empire of the institution because nobody at the center coordinating things, right? So if you look at this, influence context built up, it's partly because there's a vacuum in the EAS and it has a commission in terms of strategic thinking. It's actually EU has quite a lot of power, but very little central capacity to direct it, right? Which then explains a lot like context is so influential even though it shouldn't be. You see,
Okay, so 30 seconds, Gary, and 30 seconds you because of when you work at it.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I think probably I will be a bit slightly diverge here. So yes, I mean the regional state, as I also said, normalization is not at the table. But normalization will not happen without Palestine now, because the previous mode of the normalization was premised on the idea that the Palestinians can decide that. Almost all the Arab countries right now normalize with Israel with no regard to Palestine. Now I think the normalization is not off the table, but the previous mode is that. The next mode has to have a very significant Palestinian mode into it. And finally, yes, there isn't this geopolitical aspect, but I think on many levels, Gaza has become more global than the Ukrainian crisis. Because despite everything, the Ukraine issue, yes, there was this massive things, but it became very Western Russia things. But on the Gaza one, in terms of narrative, I mean, it is being negotiated almost at every single university, streets of the West and non-West alike. So in this regard, I think in terms of a precedent, it's more global than even Ukraine itself, in my judgment.
My 30 seconds. Thank you very much for amplifying the point I said, and I agree with it with one point that I disagree with, where you said that the Arab street doesn't have the kind of the rejection of what's happening the same way that we have in the West, and I think that is not true.
So we don't hear it, you don't see it.
Oh yes,
you
in
don't
the
hear it.
Western media, there's absolutely true. We don't hear it, we don't hear it, but in Arab media, and it is very, very dominant. Although it varies from a street to street, because also, as you know, Arab countries don't have the same freedom space for freedom of expression as you would in the West. However, I think the Arab street, if I can call it as a unified group, is extremely pro-Palestinian in this situation, and they are very active. But from the governmental perspective, I do agree as a general level, geopolitics, everything will continue with minor disruptions, including in energy, but it will overall pretty much continue as it will.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming and join me in thanking our panelists, because that has been a terrific panel. That's all I have to say.